The revolutionary journey of coffee. In the misty highlands of medieval Ethiopia, a curious goat herd named Kaldi noticed his sheep dancing, literally dancing, after eating berries from an unremarkable shrub. That moment of serendipity would trigger a chain of events that transformed human civilization more profoundly than gunpowder, steel, or gold. This simple berry would fuel revolutions, birth empires, inspire scientific breakthroughs, and ultimately reshape the very rhythm of human consciousness. From the austere prayer halls of ancient Yemen to the raucous coffee houses of revolutionary Paris, from the plantations of colonial Brazil to the sleek cafes of modern Seattle, coffee has been far more than just a drink. It is the great disruptor, the revolutionary bean that toppled the established order wherever it took root. This is the story of how a bitter forest fruit escaped the tight control of Arabian monopolies, defied religious edicts, bankrupted tea trading empires, and became the most valuable traded commodity in the world after oil, all while managing to taste increasingly delicious along the way. The journey of coffee, from sacred ritual to global phenomenon. The story begins in the only place it could, the cloud-wreathed mountains of Ethiopia's Kaffa region, where wild coffee still grows beneath towering shade trees in much the same way it did millennia ago. Here, in these ancient forests, coffee was not yet coffee. To the local Oromo people, it was **Buna**, and they didn't drink it, they ate it. Warriors would mix the raw berries with animal fat, rolling them into dense energy balls for long hunting expeditions. Others would ferment the berries into a wine-like drink that bore little resemblance to our modern brew. But it was in the monasteries of Yemen across the Red Sea where coffee's true potential would be unlocked. A Sufi mystic named Sheikh Ali ibn Omar al-Shadili, searching for a way to keep his disciples alert during their all-night prayer sessions, discovered that roasting and boiling the beans produced something miraculous. A drink that could banish sleep and sharpen the mind without the dulling effects of alcohol or opiates. The discovery spread like wildfire through religious circles. Here was a drink that could extend the day into night, that could keep the faithful awake for prayer, that could sharpen rather than dull the senses. The reaction from religious authorities was swift and predictable. Coffee was banned in Mecca in 1511, condemned as an intoxicant and therefore haram, forbidden by Islamic law. But the ban would prove futile. One story tells of Sultan Selim I, who demanded his Grand Mufti explain why he would outlaw such a delightful beverage. The Mufti, choosing his words carefully, reversed his position on the spot, declaring that roasted coffee beans were actually burnished sun seeds, and therefore a gift from Allah. The Sultan, satisfied, lifted the ban and had his first prosecutor of coffee drinkers sewn into a leather bag and dropped into the Bosphorus. The first coffee houses of the Arab world were nothing like the hushed, laptop-filled spaces we know today. They were riotous intellectual salons where men from all social classes could gather to discuss poetry, politics, and philosophy. They were called kave khane, schools of the wise. Here, a porter might challenge a professor to a game of chess. A merchant might debate philosophy with a scholar. News and gossip spread faster than official proclamations, and the seeds of political dissent found fertile soil. The Ottoman authorities soon realized they had a problem on their hands. Coffee wasn't just keeping people awake, it was making them think. By 1570, there were over 600 coffee houses in Constantinople alone. The drink that had begun as a Sufi secret had become the lifeblood of the Ottoman Empire. When a sultan's bride demanded he promise to keep me supplied with coffee in their marriage contract, it marked more than just a quirky historical footnote. It signaled coffee's transformation from religious aid to social necessity. The bean that would change the world was about to break free of its Middle Eastern confines, and Europe would never be the same. The Ottoman Coffee Revolution: How a Drink Shaped Modern Society. In 1580, a thunderstruck Venetian botanist named Prosper Alpini stood in a Constantinople market, watching as men in silk robes hunched over small brass pots filled with a bubbling black liquid. The drink, he noted with clinical fascination, appeared to render men sterile. This outlandish claim would become one of many myths that followed coffee on its march across Europe, alongside warnings that it caused impotence, melancholia, and madness. Yet within a century, this supposedly dangerous Turkish drink would transform European society more radically than any invasion or plague. The Turks had turned coffee into psychological warfare. When the Ottoman army laid siege to Vienna in 1683, they brought their coffee with them. Each morning, the besieged Viennese would wake to the aroma of Turkish coffee wafting over their walls, a daily reminder of the vast empire at their gates. When the siege finally broke, the retreating Turks left behind sacks of strange green beans, which the Viennese initially planned to burn. But a clever Polish military officer named Jerzy Franciszek Kolczycki, who had lived among the Ottomans, recognized the treasure. He claimed the beans as his reward for serving as a spy during the siege, opened Vienna's first coffee house, and invented the practice of filtering coffee and adding milk, transforming the bitter Turkish brew into something that delighted European palates. Venice, Europe's gateway to the East, became ground zero for coffee's conquest of the continent. The city's first coffee house, Café Florian, opened in 1720 and still stands today. But it was more than just a shop. It was a revolution in human consciousness. Unlike ale houses, coffee houses stayed open past midnight, their rooms lit by candlelight and intellectual discourse. The greatest minds of the Enlightenment gravitated to these spaces where sobriety and sharp wit were prized above all. Voltaire allegedly consumed 40 cups daily while writing. The Paris Stock Exchange was born in a coffee house. The American and French revolutions were plotted over coffee cups. The Church made one last attempt to stop coffee's inexorable spread. Priests in Venice denounced this bitter invention of Satan. The controversy grew so fierce that Pope Clement VIII himself was asked to intervene. The Pope demanded to taste this diabolic drink before rendering judgment. After one sip, he smiled and declared, "This devil's drink is so delicious we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." The battle was over. Coffee had won. By 1700, London alone had over 3,000 coffee houses. They were known as penny universities because for the price of a coffee, anyone could join the great conversations of the age. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, frequented by ship captains and merchants, evolved into Lloyd's of London. Jonathan's Coffee House became the London Stock Exchange. The Grecian Coffee House was where Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley debated the nature of the universe. A new kind of society was emerging in these rooms, one where ideas flowed as freely as coffee, where social barriers dissolved in cups of black liquid, and where the modern world was being born, one caffeine-fueled conversation at a time. The global revolution of coffee, from rebellion to commodity. The year was 1776, and John Adams was writing to his wife Abigail about America's future. "Tea must be universally renounced," he declared, "and I must be weaned, and the sooner the better." This personal revolution in the Adams household mirrored the larger transformation sweeping through the colonies. Coffee, once considered the drink of rebellious Turks, had become the beverage of American patriots. In the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, drinking coffee became nothing less than a patriotic duty. But behind this caffeinated revolution lurked a darker truth. The Caribbean islands had become vast coffee plantations, their native forests cleared to make way for endless rows of coffee trees. Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, produced half the world's coffee by 1780 through a system of brutality that would ultimately trigger the largest slave revolt in history. The French colonists had discovered that coffee trees thrived in the island's mountain soil, and they drove their enslaved workers to plant higher and higher up the slopes, creating new microclimate growing regions that would later revolutionize coffee cultivation worldwide. In the salons of Paris, coffee had birthed a new profession, the café critic. These self-appointed arbiters of taste wrote elaborate guides rating the subtle differences between coffee houses, creating the world's first restaurant reviews. But while French aristocrats debated the finer points of coffee service, their Caribbean plantations were creating unsustainable social tensions. When revolution finally erupted in Saint-Domingue, the rebels burned the coffee plantations first. The smell of roasting coffee beans mixed with gunpowder became the signature scent of freedom. The British, watching their colonial tea trade collapse, made a fateful decision. The East India Company began cultivating coffee in India, creating new strains that could thrive in the challenging monsoon climate. They discovered that aging the beans in the humid monsoon winds created a uniquely smooth flavor, the famous monsoon Malabar beans that would transform coffee from a commodity into an art form. But they had started too late. The American colonies were lost, and a new nation was rising, powered by coffee rather than tea. In Salem, Massachusetts, a merchant named Elias Haskett Derby saw an opportunity in this disruption of traditional trade routes. He retrofitted his ships specifically for the coffee trade, installing specialized ventilation systems to prevent the beans from spoiling during long ocean voyages. His innovations would make Salem the coffee capital of the New World and create America's first millionaire. More importantly, they would establish a new principle, that coffee was no longer just a drink, but a sophisticated global commodity that required scientific precision to transport and prepare. The modern coffee trade was born. The global transformation of coffee, from heist to commodity. The year was 1616, and Peter van den Broeke, a Dutch merchant, was about to commit the heist of the century. While the Ottoman Empire maintained its ruthless monopoly on coffee cultivation, van den Broeke managed to smuggle a few coffee plants out of Mocha, Yemen, an act tantamount to treason under Ottoman law. The plants were whisked away to Amsterdam's botanical gardens, where they languished in the cold Dutch climate, but proved something vital. Coffee could grow outside Arabia. The Dutch East India Company saw the future in those struggling plants. They shifted their focus to Java, an island whose volcanic soil and tropical climate seemed perfect for coffee cultivation. But there was a problem. They needed more plants, and the Ottomans had tightened security. Enter Nicholas Whitson, the mayor of Amsterdam, who orchestrated what might be history's most sophisticated act of agricultural espionage. He convinced the Dutch ambassador to Paris to seduce someone with access to the closely guarded coffee plants in the Royal Botanical Gardens, plants that had been gifted to Louis XIV by the Dutch themselves years earlier. The plan worked. In 1696, a coffee plant arrived in Java, wrapped in silk and protected by a special heated compartment aboard a Dutch East India Company ship. Within decades, the Dutch colonial possession produced more coffee than Arabia had in centuries. The Ottoman monopoly was broken, but the Dutch created something perhaps even more insidious: the first modern agricultural plantation system, complete with quota systems and forced labor that would become the template for colonial exploitation worldwide. Brazil's coffee empire began with a scandal. Lieutenant Colonel Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent to French Guiana in 1727 to mediate a border dispute. His real mission: obtain coffee seeds which the French guarded zealously. Palheta seduced the French governor's wife, who gifted him a farewell bouquet spiked with coffee seedlings. Those smuggled plants would transform Brazil into the world's largest coffee producer, a position it holds to this day. But nature had one last twist in the tale. In 1869, a mysterious disease began destroying coffee plantations across Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, then the world's largest coffee producer. Coffee rust, a fungus that turns leaves into copper-colored skeletons, spread unstoppably across Asia. The British Empire's coffee dreams withered, forcing them to convert their Ceylon plantations to tea. Only one major coffee variety proved resistant: Robusta. This hardy but bitter bean would go on to fuel the instant coffee revolution of the 20th century, while its more delicate cousin, Arabica, became the foundation of specialty coffee culture. The Dutch heist had unleashed forces its perpetrators could never have imagined. Coffee had broken free of its Arabian cradle, but in doing so, it had become something new. A global commodity that would reshape economies, transform landscapes, and rewrite the rules of international trade. The bean that had once been Arabia's most closely guarded secret was now the world's second most valuable traded commodity, and its journey was far from over. The global legacy of coffee: empires, economies, and revolutions. Miner Keith stood at the edge of his Costa Rican coffee plantation in 1871, surveying not the neat rows of coffee trees, but the bodies of his dead workers. The railroad he was building to transport coffee had claimed the lives of 17,000 laborers, including his 3 brothers. Yet Keith persisted, driven by a vision that would reshape Central America. By the time he finished, his United Fruit Company controlled not just railways and plantations, but entire nations. The term Banana Republic entered the lexicon, but it was coffee that truly ruled these lands. The rise of Guatemala's coffee dynasty began with a single decree. In 1877, President Justo Rufino Barrios abolished communal land ownership, effectively seizing indigenous territories and redistributing them to European coffee planters. The new coffee barons needed workers, so Barrios solved this problem by instituting debt peonage, a system that bound indigenous people to plantations through perpetual debt. Within a generation, 54 families controlled almost everything in Guatemala. They were known simply as the 54, and their power was absolute. In El Salvador, coffee created the 14 families who controlled the nation's destiny through their coffee wealth. When peasants revolted in 1932, the government controlled by coffee interests responded with La Matanza, the massacre, killing 30,000 people in what became known as the Coffee Revolution. The message was clear. Coffee had become more valuable than human life. But in Colombia, coffee followed a different path. The Colombian Coffee Growers Federation, FNC, founded in 1927, represented small farmers rather than plantation owners. They created Juan Valdez, the fictional coffee farmer who became the face of Colombian coffee worldwide. More importantly, they established a minimum price for coffee, protecting small growers from market fluctuations. This model would later inspire the fair trade movement, proving that coffee could build sustainable economies rather than just extract wealth. The story of coffee in Brazil culminated in one of history's most audacious economic schemes. By 1906, Brazil produced so much coffee that prices were collapsing. The government's solution: buy all excess coffee and store it. They filled warehouses, ships, and even entire islands with coffee beans. When prices still didn't rise, they simply burned the excess millions of bags of coffee set ablaze in what became known as the Great Coffee Conflagration. The scheme worked, temporarily stabilizing prices, but it also revealed a fundamental truth: coffee had become too big to fail. San Francisco's Hills Bros. Coffee pioneered vacuum-packed coffee in 1900, inadvertently creating America's first national coffee brand. But it was in Seattle where coffee would find its most unlikely renaissance. A small coffee roaster named Starbucks, founded in 1971, would transform from a local bean seller into a global empire by convincing the world that coffee wasn't just a commodity. It was an experience. The wheel had turned full circle. From the ancient coffeehouses of Yemen to the modern cafes of Seattle, coffee once again became a place as much as a drink. The science and innovation behind the perfect cup of coffee. In a dimly lit laboratory in 1938, a young chemist named Max Morgenthaler stared at his latest failure. After 7 years and thousands of experiments, he still couldn't solve the riddle of instant coffee that actually tasted good. Nestlé had nearly abandoned the project, but Morgenthaler remained obsessed. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the study of blood plasma preservation. By adding carbohydrates before drying the coffee extract, he created crystals that preserved the coffee's flavor compounds. Project Nescafé was born, and with it, the democratization of coffee consumption. Meanwhile, in Milan, Achille Gaggia was fighting with physics. The standard coffee machines of 1947 produced bitter brews by forcing steam through grounds at low pressure. Gaggia, a bar owner obsessed with the perfect cup, discovered that leveraging hydraulic pressure could force hot, not boiling water through coffee at 9 atmospheres of pressure. The result was crema, the golden foam atop espresso that had never existed before in human history. He had created not just a new machine, but an entirely new beverage. The chemistry of coffee reveals an astonishing complexity: over 1,000 aroma compounds that make wine seem simple by comparison. The roasting process itself is a cascade of chemical reactions known as Maillard reactions, the same processes that brown bread and sear steak. But coffee's magic lies in its unique ability to trigger multiple pleasure centers in the human brain. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, preventing drowsiness while triggering the release of dopamine. Meanwhile, the aroma compounds stimulate the production of serotonin. Coffee isn't just a drink, it's a precisely calibrated psychoactive cocktail. The revolution of precision brewing began with Don Castillo's invention of the pour-over dripper in 1958. His design, a simple cone with a 60-degree angle and spiral ridges, created the optimal flow rate for coffee extraction. Japanese coffee scientists later discovered that brewing coffee is an exercise in thermodynamics. The ideal extraction occurs in a temperature window between 195 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit. Any hotter burns the coffee, any cooler leaves flavor compounds trapped in the grounds. Modern coffee cultivation has become an exercise in advanced genetics. At research stations in Panama, scientists race against climate change, developing hybrid varieties that can survive higher temperatures while maintaining the complex flavor compounds that make specialty coffee possible. They've discovered that coffee trees under stress produce more complex sugars, which is why the best coffees often come from plants growing at their altitude limit, where the struggle for survival creates extraordinary flavors. The cutting edge of coffee science today exists in laboratories where researchers use gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to identify the specific molecules that create pleasure. They've discovered that light roasts preserve chlorogenic acid, a potent antioxidant, while dark roasts produce N-methylpyridinium, a compound that prevents stomach cells from producing excess acid. The perfect roast level, it turns out, depends on your own genetic makeup and sensitivity to specific compounds. Coffee appreciation is literally written in our DNA. The modern coffee revolution, from Starbucks to underground movements. In 1971, 3 college friends placed a 1-pound roaster in a cramped storefront at Seattle's Pike Place Market. Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker had no business plan for Starbucks, just an obsession with perfectly roasted beans and a Dutch immigrant named Alfred Peet, who had taught them the dark art of coffee roasting. They couldn't have known they were lighting the fuse of a revolution that would transform global culture. The real catalyst for change came in 1982, when a charismatic salesman named Howard Schultz walked into their shop. During a buying trip to Milan, Schultz had experienced an epiphany watching baristas perform their morning ballet of espresso making. The theater of coffee preparation, the community of the cafe, these were what Americans were missing. When the original owners refused to transform their bean store into a cafe, Schultz left to start his own company. 5 years later, he bought Starbucks for $3.8 million. By 2022, it was worth over $100 billion. But while Starbucks was building an empire, a counter-revolution was brewing. In 2008, a former software engineer named James Freeman opened Blue Bottle Coffee in Oakland, challenging every convention of modern coffee service. His cafe served no dark roasts, no flavored syrups, no drinks over 8 ounces. Every cup was brewed to order, often taking 5 minutes to prepare. The third wave of coffee had arrived, treating coffee with the reverence of wine and the precision of science. Technology transformed the home brewing landscape. In 2012, Alan Adler, an engineering instructor and frisbee designer, invented the AeroPress in his garage. This simple plastic tube, using principles of pneumatics and fluid dynamics, could produce coffee that rivaled professional machines costing thousands more. The democratization of specialty coffee accelerated as professional-grade equipment became accessible to enthusiasts, spawning a global community of home roasters and barista champions. Climate change has forced a reckoning in the coffee world. Rising temperatures threaten traditional growing regions, pushing cultivation higher up mountain slopes. In response, World Coffee Research, funded by a consortium of companies, launched an unprecedented effort to develop climate-resilient varieties. They discovered that forgotten heirloom varieties, preserved in Ethiopia's forests, might hold the genetic keys to coffee's survival. The future of coffee is being written in laboratories where scientists are breaking down the coffee genome, in startups creating lab-grown coffee molecules, and in space stations where NASA experiments with zero-gravity brewing. Seattle's Atomo Coffee has created molecular coffee, a beanless brew engineered to taste like coffee while eliminating agriculture entirely. Meanwhile, farmers in Panama are selling specially processed geisha variety beans for over $1,000 per pound, proving that coffee can command prices rivaling fine wines. The latest frontier is coffee terrorism, the weaponization of coffee knowledge itself. Professional tasters now avoid revealing their favorite cafes, knowing that sudden popularity can overwhelm small roasters and destroy the very quality that made them special. In response, an underground coffee scene has emerged, with invitation-only tasting rooms and secret roasteries operating like speakeasies of the modern age. Coffee, the drink that once fueled revolutions, has become a revolution unto itself. Coffee, humanity's constant companion. The International Space Station circles Earth at 17,500 miles per hour, but inside, an astronaut waits 5 careful minutes for her coffee to brew. The IS espresso machine, engineered by Lavazza and Argotec, uses sophisticated fluid dynamics to create the perfect cup in zero gravity. This $250,000 device might seem extravagant, but it represents something profound. Wherever humanity goes, coffee follows. We no longer adapt coffee to our environment, we adapt our environment to coffee. In the mountains of Peru, tribal communities have begun integrating coffee trees into ancient forest management techniques, creating a new agricultural model called analog forestry. Rather than clearing land for plantations, they're weaving coffee into existing ecosystems. The result is not just sustainable agriculture, but the preservation of endangered species and indigenous knowledge. Coffee, which once drove deforestation, is now protecting forests. Deep in Silicon Valley, synthetic biologists are programming yeast cells to produce coffee proteins, while in London, quantum computers model the perfect roast profile by simulating molecular interactions. The college students who once pulled all-nighters with cheap instant coffee are now venture capitalists investing millions in coffee tech startups. An industry born in medieval monasteries has become a testing ground for humanity's most advanced technologies. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation is occurring in coffee's birthplace. Ethiopia's traditional forest coffee farms are being recognized by UNESCO as living museums, repositories of genetic diversity that could hold the key to coffee's survival in a warming world. The same forests where Chaldee's goats once danced have become humanity's insurance policy against an uncertain future. As we stand on the brink of new frontiers, space colonization, climate change, artificial intelligence, coffee continues to evolve with us. Quantum roasters, neural network taste predictors, and carbon-negative coffee farms aren't science fiction. They're already in development. The drink that fueled the Enlightenment is now powering the next great leap forward. Yet, for all our technical sophistication, we haven't improved on the fundamental magic of coffee. Its ability to bring people together, to spark conversation, to fuel dreams. From Ethiopian ceremonies that take hours to perform, to the grab-and-go caffeine fixes of modern cities, coffee remains a ritual that marks our days and connects us to a tradition spanning centuries and continents. In the end, coffee's greatest achievement isn't the empires it built or the revolutions it funded. It's the conversations it started and continues to start, one cup at a time.